The sun was setting over Pine Grove City, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Officer Mike Reynolds sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched traffic flow past on Cedar Street. He'd been having what he considered a slow day, only 4 traffic stops, all of which had left a bitter taste in his mouth when the drivers didn't fit his idea of what belonged in this upscale neighborhood. His radio crackled with routine updates, but he barely paid attention. His mind was already made up about today's quota. That's when he spotted it, a sleek black BMW cruising down the street. The car was pristine, clearly well-maintained, but that's not what caught Reynolds' attention. It was the driver. Through the tinted windows, Reynolds could make out the silhouette of someone who didn't match his prejudiced view of who should be driving such an expensive car in this part of town. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and pulled out behind the BMW. The BMW's driver responded perfectly, signaling immediately and pulling over in a safe spot, well off the main road. This smooth compliance only seemed to irritate Reynolds more. He sat in his car for an extra minute, a tactic he often used to make people nervous, before approaching the vehicle. As he walked up, his flashlight beam intentionally aimed to blind the driver through the side mirror. Reynolds noticed the car's immaculate condition. No scratches, no dents, not even a speck of dust. This was someone who took pride in their vehicle. The registration sticker was current, and a quick glance showed no obvious violations. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. The driver remained remarkably composed, reaching slowly and deliberately for the documents in question. "Good evening, officer," the driver said in a measured, professional tone that somehow made Reynolds even more agitated. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The question was perfectly reasonable and legally within the driver's rights, but Reynolds treated it like an act of defiance. "You made an illegal lane change back there," he lied, knowing full well he hadn't witnessed any such thing. The driver's response was calm and respectful. "I'm certain I used my turn signal and checked my mirrors before every lane change, officer. I always do." Reynolds' body language shifted. He stood straighter, puffed out his chest, and moved his hand to rest on his belt, a subtle intimidation tactic he perfected over years of similar stops. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Officer, I don't understand. I've provided my documentation, and I haven't committed any traffic violations. Is there a specific reason you need me to exit my vehicle?" The measured response and perfect grammar only fueled Reynolds' prejudices. He was someone he thought shouldn't be so well-spoken, shouldn't be so calm, shouldn't be driving this car in this neighborhood. The cognitive dissonance made him increasingly aggressive. "I said step out of the vehicle. To not make me repeat myself again." Reynolds' voice echoed down the quiet street, drawing attention from nearby houses. A few porch lights flicked on, and curtains twitched as curious neighbors peered out at the scene unfolding before them. What Officer Reynolds failed to notice in his escalating anger was the small red light on his body camera blinking steadily, recording every word, every action, and every abuse of power. He also missed the distinctive department-issued pen clipped to the driver's breast pocket, a detail that would soon turn his world upside down. As the driver carefully complied with the order, stepping out with hands visible and movements slow and non-threatening, Reynolds was already reaching for his handcuffs. His mind was made up before the stop even began, but he had no idea that this particular traffic stop would become the catalyst for his own undoing and a department-wide reckoning with systemic prejudice. Little did Reynolds know, each second of this interaction was being documented not just by his own body camera, but by several other recording devices, and the driver he was about to arrest was someone who would change not just his career, but the entire department's approach to community policing. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Officer Reynolds moved to handcuff the BMW's driver. The evening air had grown cooler, and nearby crickets fell silent, as if sensing the tension in the air. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on their porches, smartphones raised and recording the scene that was unfolding before them. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Reynolds commanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone who expected instant compliance. The driver, still maintaining remarkable composure, spoke clearly enough for both Reynolds' body camera and the gathering witnesses to hear. "Officer, I want to cooperate fully, but I need to understand the reason for my arrest. I haven't broken any laws." The man's voice remained steady, professional, and somehow both firm and respectful at the same time. This measured response only seemed to aggravate Reynolds further. His face flushed red with anger, visible even in the dim evening light. "You're being arrested for resisting arrest and failure to comply with a police officer's orders." A nearby witness muttered, "How can someone be arrested for resisting arrest when there was no reason for arrest in the first place?" The comment carried across the quiet street, causing Reynolds to shoot an angry glare in the direction of the growing crowd. The driver slowly turned around, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I want to state clearly for the record that I am not resisting, but I am expressing my objection to this unlawful detention." His words were measured, almost as if he dealt with similar situations before, though not from this perspective. Reynolds roughly grabbed the driver's wrists, applying the handcuffs with unnecessary force. The metal clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. A few gasps came from the onlooking neighbors, and more phones were raised to capture the scene. "The cuffs are too tight," the driver stated calmly. "They're cutting off my circulation." Reynolds ignored the complaint, instead beginning to pat down the man's expensive suit with aggressive movements that nearly knocked him off balance. During the pat-down, Reynolds pulled out the man's wallet, letting various cards scatter across the ground. As he bent to pick them up, his flashlight beam caught something that made his hand freeze mid-reach, an official department ID card, face down on the asphalt. But Reynolds was too far committed to his course of action to back down now. He quickly pocketed the ID without looking at it properly, convinced that it must be fake. After all, it didn't fit his preconceived notions about the driver. "You're going to have to explain that fake police ID too," Reynolds sneered, leading the handcuffed man toward the patrol car. Impersonating an officer is a serious offense. The driver remained silent now, but there was a slight change in his demeanor, not fear or anger, but something closer to resigned determination. As Reynolds opened the back door of his patrol car, a senior couple watching from their porch called out, "We've got it all on video, sir. We won't let this stand." Reynolds slammed the patrol car's door shut with more force than necessary, drowning out the supportive calls from the neighbors. He stormed around to the driver's seat, his movements rigid with barely contained fury. The gathering crowd had grown to nearly 20 people, all with phones recording, all witnessing what would soon become a defining moment in the department's history. As Reynolds started the engine, he glanced in his rearview mirror at his passenger. The man sat perfectly straight despite the handcuffs, his expression unreadable, but his eyes intense and observant. Something about that steady gaze made Reynolds uncomfortable, but he pushed the feeling aside. The drive to the precinct was tense and silent. Reynolds took a longer route than necessary, perhaps trying to gather his thoughts or calm his anger. But with each passing minute, he was only digging himself deeper into a situation that was about to explode in his face. What Reynolds didn't know was that his passenger had already pressed an emergency alert button on his watch the moment he was pulled over, standard procedure for his position. By the time they would reach the precinct, several high-ranking officers would be waiting. The wheels of justice were already in motion, though not in the direction Officer Reynolds imagined. As the patrol car pulled into the station's parking lot, Reynolds noticed unusual activity for this time of evening. Several senior officers were gathered near the entrance, and the watch commander's car was parked in its reserved spot, something that rarely happened during the night shift. Still, Reynolds convinced himself this had nothing to do with his arrest. After all, he was just bringing in another troublemaker, or so he thought. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, his entire world would turn upside down. The driver he'd arrested with such prejudiced confidence was about to reveal his true identity, and Reynolds' career would never be the same. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Reynolds marched his handcuffed suspect through the station's back entrance. The night shift was usually quiet, but tonight felt different. Officers who normally wouldn't spare a glance were staring, and the usual chatter had died down to whispers. Reynolds guided his arrestee toward the booking desk, maintaining his grip on the man's arm with unnecessary force. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the person in handcuffs. He quickly reached for his phone. "I need to process this suspect," Reynolds announced, pulling out his notepad to begin the paperwork. Illegal lane change, resisting arrest, and possession of falsified police credentials. He said the last part with particular satisfaction, still convinced he'd caught someone impersonating an officer. The desk sergeant cleared his throat. "Officer Reynolds, I think you should." Before he could finish, the watch commander burst through the door, almost running. His face was a mix of disbelief and horror. "Reynolds, release him immediately." Reynolds turned, confused by the command. "Sir, I caught this guy with fake police ID." "That ID isn't fake, you fool." The watch commander's voice echoed through the suddenly silent station. "You just arrested the new Internal Affairs Division Chief." The color drained from Reynolds' face as the words stank in. His hands, which had been confidently filling out arrest forms moments ago, began to shake. The ID he'd stuffed in his pocket earlier suddenly felt like it was burning a hole through his uniform. "Someone get those cuffs off him right now," the watch commander ordered. Another officer quickly stepped forward with keys, hands trembling slightly as he removed the handcuffs from the division chief's wrists. The Internal Affairs chief rolled his shoulders slowly, rubbing his wrists where the too tight handcuffs had left angry red marks. He hadn't said a word since entering the station, but his eyes hadn't missed a detail. He noted every officer's reaction, every whispered comment, every subtle exchange of glances. Reynolds stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The realization of what he'd done, who he'd done it to, hit him like a physical blow. The chief's expensive suit, his professional demeanor, the department-issued pen he'd ignored, the ID he'd dismissed without proper examination, it all made terrible sense now. "Officer Reynolds," the chief spoke for the first time since entering the station, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your conduct this evening. But first, I'd like to see the footage from your body camera." Reynolds' hand instinctively went to his camera, which was still blinking red. Everything, every word, every action, every moment of prejudiced behavior had been recorded. His other hand went to the ID in his pocket, finally pulling it out to look at it properly. The chief's credentials were clear, official, and unmistakably genuine. The watch commander directed them to his office, closing the door behind them. Through the office blinds, officers could see Reynolds sink into a chair, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered. The chief remained standing, his posture relaxed, but commanding the room's attention. Outside the office, the station buzzed with urgent whispers. Officers who had worked with Reynolds, who had witnessed his previous behaviors but stayed silent, exchanged knowing looks. Some pulled out their phones, texting other officers who weren't on duty. The news would spread through the department like wildfire. Reynolds had finally gone too far. Inside the office, the chief was reviewing the body camera footage on a laptop. His face remained neutral as he watched the traffic stop unfold from Reynolds' perspective. The audio clearly picked up every unnecessary command, every aggressive tone, every fabricated charge. Reynolds sat in his chair, sweating despite the officer's cool air conditioning. His career flashed before his eyes. Years of similar stops, similar assumptions, similar behavior. But this time, he hadn't just pulled over another civilian. He'd unknowingly targeted the one person in the department with the power to expose and end his discriminatory practices. The chief paused the video and looked directly at Reynolds. "Officer," he said, his voice level and professional, "I think it's time we had an honest discussion about your approach to community policing." He gestured to the laptop screen, where Reynolds could see his own reflection in the BM Blaze window. "And I want you to explain to me, in your own words, exactly what probable cause you had for this traffic stop." The watch commander leaned against his desk, arms crossed, as Reynolds struggled to find words that wouldn't incriminate him further. But they all knew. The body camera footage told the real story, and there would be no talking his way out of this one. His years of unchecked bias had finally caught up with him, and the consequences would reshape not just his career, but the entire department's approach to policing. The next morning, the Internal Affairs office was buzzing with activity. Computer screens displayed countless hours of body camera footage, while analysts pored over years of traffic stop data. The chief sat at his desk, his suit as crisp as ever, showing no signs of the previous night's ordeal except for faint marks on his wrists. "Put everything else on hold," he instructed his team. "I want a complete analysis of Officer Reynolds' record. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every civilian complaint for the past 5 years." His voice was steady, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made his team work with renewed purpose. As data began flowing in, a disturbing pattern emerged. One analyst called the chief over to her screen, pointing at a color-coded map of Reynolds' traffic stops. "Sir, look at this. The numbers are, well, they're impossible to ignore." The map showed hundreds of dots representing traffic stops. The concentration in certain neighborhoods was striking, as was the demographic breakdown of the drivers stopped. Another screen showed arrest rates that told an even more troubling story. In the past year alone, the analyst explained, pulling up a spreadsheet, Reynolds conducted 427 traffic stops. The demographic breakdown doesn't match the community's population at all. And look at these search rates. Down the hall, 2 other investigators were reviewing civilian complaints. The stack of files was thick, but many complaints had been dismissed without proper investigation. As they dug deeper, they found multiple instances where other officers had witnessed Reynolds' behavior but remained silent. "Chief," one investigator called out, holding up a particularly concerning file. "We found something you need to see. 3 months ago, another officer filed a report expressing concerns about Reynolds' conduct, but it was buried by his supervisor." The chief took the file, his expression growing more serious as he read. He picked up his phone and dialed the police commissioner's office. "Sir, we need to expand this investigation. It's not just Reynolds. We're looking at a systemic failure of oversight." By midday, the department's largest conference room had been converted into a command center. Timeline charts covered one wall, showing Reynolds' career history. Another wall displayed demographic data and statistics. Boxes of complaints and reports were stacked on tables, each one representing a potential case of biased policing. The chief stood in front of his team, addressing them with quiet determination. "What happened last night was no accident. I didn't randomly encounter Officer Reynolds. We'd received multiple complaints about an officer targeting minority drivers in that neighborhood. I chose to investigate personally because the pattern was so clear, but even I didn't expect things to unfold as they did." He pointed to the wall of data. "This isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. This is about a culture that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. I want every complaint reinvestigated. Interview every witness again. Review every piece of body camera footage." As the afternoon wore on, more officers began coming forward. Some had witnessed Reynolds' misconduct but feared retaliation if they reported it. Others had similar concerns about different officers. The investigation was expanding beyond Reynolds, revealing cracks in the department's entire disciplinary system. The chief's phone buzzed constantly with updates. Local community leaders were calling, sharing stories they'd heard from residents. Civil rights organizations were offering additional documentation. The media had gotten wind of the story, and reporters were gathering outside the station. In the break room, investigators shared worried looks over coffee. "Did you see the footage from last December?" one asked. "The one with the grandmother and her grandson?" "Yeah," another replied, shaking his head. "And that's just what we caught on camera. Think about all the stops that weren't recorded." The chief walked in during this conversation, pouring himself a coffee as he listened. "That's exactly why we're here," he said, surprising the investigators. "This isn't just about punishing one officer. This is about fixing a broken system." He paused, looking at his reflection in the dark coffee. The marks on his wrists had faded, but the memory of those handcuffs was still fresh. "Every person who experienced what I did last night deserves justice. Every complaint that was ignored deserves to be heard. And every officer who stayed silent needs to understand why that silence was part of the problem." Back in the conference room, the investigation team had set up a hotline for other officers to report similar incidents. The phones hadn't stopped ringing. Each call added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. As evening approached, the chief stood at the window of his office, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same colors he'd seen during last night's traffic stop. On his desk lay the preliminary report, hundreds of pages documenting years of biased policing. Tomorrow, he would present these findings to the commissioner, but tonight he had one more task. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "This is the Internal Affairs Chief. I need to schedule a formal interview with Officer Reynolds for tomorrow morning. And tell him to bring his union representative. He's going to need it." The video of Reynolds' traffic stop hit social media like a thunderbolt. Someone from the gathering crowd that night had posted their recording, and within hours it had gone viral. The footage showed everything: the unnecessary aggression, the baseless arrest, and most damaging of all, the moment when the truth about the driver's identity was revealed at the station. Local news stations picked up the story immediately. Breaking news: police officer unknowingly arrests Internal Affairs Chief during biased traffic stop, ran across TV screens throughout the city. The comment sections exploded with people sharing their own similar experiences with law enforcement. Back at the station, the Internal Affairs Office had set up 3 large screens to monitor the growing public response. The chief watched as clips from Reynolds' body camera footage began circulating online, his face showing no emotion as he witnessed his own arrest from a different angle. "Sir," called one of his team members, "you need to see this." She pulled up a social media thread where other officers from neighboring districts were beginning to speak out. The post that caught her attention came from a retired officer who had worked with Reynolds years ago. What happened that night wasn't an isolated incident. We all knew. We all stayed quiet. And that silence made us part of the problem. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Community members were calling in with their own stories, many involving Reynolds, others about similar experiences with different officers. Each call was carefully logged, each story added to the growing mountain of evidence. In the break room, officers gathered around the TV, watching as more body camera footage was released to the public. The videos showed a clear pattern: Reynolds consistently treating minority drivers differently, making up violations, escalating routine stops into confrontations. "I had no idea it was this bad," one young officer whispered, watching footage of Reynolds harassing an elderly man during a stop last winter. "How did we let this go on for so long?" The chief walked in during this conversation, causing the room to fall silent. "That's exactly the question we need to answer," he said, pouring himself a coffee. "It's not just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that allowed those actions to continue." Outside the station, news vans lined the street. Reporters camped out, hoping to catch anyone involved in the investigation. Community leaders held impromptu press conferences on the sidewalk, demanding accountability not just for Reynolds, but for the entire department. Inside, the evidence room had been transformed into a war room for the investigation. One wall was covered with a timeline of Reynolds' career, red flags marking each documented incident of bias. Another wall displayed screenshots from social media, showing the public's reaction to the unfolding story. The chief's team had uncovered something else: a pattern in Reynolds' patrol routes. A digital map showed how he would deliberately position himself in certain neighborhoods, targeting specific communities. The data was damning. Of his last 500 traffic stops, the demographic breakdown was so skewed it couldn't be explained away as coincidence. "Look at this," an analyst called out, pointing to her screen. She had been analyzing Reynolds' body camera footage using new pattern recognition software. He uses the same phrases, the same tactics, the same escalation points in almost every stop involving minority drivers. But with other drivers, she pulled up split-screen comparisons showing the stark difference in his behavior. The chief leaned over her shoulder, watching the side-by-side footage. In one video, Reynolds was aggressive and confrontational with a minority driver over a minor issue. In the other, taken the same day, he was polite and professional with a different driver who had committed the same violation. Community organizations began sharing their own data, years of complaints and documented incidents that had never received proper attention. Local civil rights groups provided statements from people who had been too afraid to come forward before. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the case. The department's public affairs office was overwhelmed. News organizations from across the country were requesting comments. The story had struck a nerve, becoming part of a national conversation about bias in law enforcement. Late that afternoon, the chief received an unexpected visit from an older officer near retirement. "Sir," the officer said, closing the office door behind him, "I need to tell you something about Reynolds. Something that happened 5 years ago that never made it into any report." As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the office windows, the chief listened to yet another story of witnessed bias and enforced silence. But this time, there was something different in the air. A sense that the wall of silence was finally crumbling. On his desk, next to the growing case file, lay a photo from the night of his arrest. It showed him in handcuffs, standing tall despite the situation, while Reynolds loomed in the background, his face twisted with unwarranted anger. The image had become a symbol of everything that needed to change. The chief picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning," he said. "It's time to show the public exactly what we found." As he hung up, he knew tomorrow would be a turning point, not just for Reynolds, but for the entire department. The morning of the departmental hearing arrived with a weight of anticipation hanging in the air. The largest conference room had been converted into a makeshift hearing chamber, with rows of chairs facing a long table where the review board would sit. By 8 a.m., every seat was filled. Officers, community members, and local officials all gathered to witness what many were calling a watershed moment for the department. Officer Reynolds sat alone at a small table, his usual confident posture replaced by a nervous slouch. His union representative sat nearby, shuffling through papers with a worried expression. The evidence against Reynolds was overwhelming, and everyone knew it. The Internal Affairs chief entered the room last, carrying a thick binder of documents. The room fell silent as he took his place at the center of the review board's table. Despite being the victim in the initial incident, department regulations allowed him to oversee the hearing due to his position and the broader implications of the case. "This hearing is now in session," he announced, his voice steady and clear. "We are here to review the conduct of Officer Reynolds, not just from the night of my arrest, but throughout his entire career with this department." The presentation of evidence began with the video from that fateful traffic stop. The footage played on large screens mounted on the walls, showing every moment from multiple angles, Reynolds' body camera, nearby security cameras, and videos taken by witnesses. The room watched in silence as the scene unfolded. "Officer Reynolds," the chief began, "can you explain to this board why you initiated that traffic stop?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I observed a traffic violation." "Let me stop you there," the chief interrupted, pulling up a split screen showing the BMW's entire journey that evening. "As you can see, there were no violations. The car maintained proper speed, used turn signals appropriately, and followed all traffic laws. Would you like to revise your statement?" The room remained silent as Reynolds struggled to find words. His union representative whispered something in his ear, but he just shook his head. The chief continued, now displaying a series of graphs and charts. Over the past 5 years, Officer Reynolds conducted 2,187 traffic stops. The demographic breakdown of these stops shows a clear and disturbing pattern. He walked through the numbers methodically, letting each statistic sink in. But it wasn't just about numbers. The chief had prepared something more powerful. "We're going to hear from some of the people affected by Officer Reynolds' actions." One by one, citizens came forward to share their experiences. Their stories were different, but the pattern was the same: unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior, baseless searches. During a brief recess, officers in the hallway spoke in hushed tones. "Did you see his face when they showed the body camera footage from the Thompson family stop?" one whispered. "He couldn't even look at the screen." Back in the hearing room, the chief moved on to the most damaging evidence: testimony from fellow officers. Those who had witnessed Reynolds' misconduct but stayed silent were now speaking up. Their statements painted a picture of a department culture that had allowed bias to go unchecked. "Officer Lee," the chief addressed one of the witnesses, "you stated in your testimony that you observed Officer Reynolds conducting questionable stops as far back as 2019. Why didn't you report this behavior?" The officer's response was barely audible. I didn't think anyone would listen. I was afraid of retaliation." As the afternoon wore on, Reynolds seemed to shrink further into his chair with each new piece of evidence. The union representative had long since stopped taking notes, realizing the futility of mounting any defense. The chief saved the most compelling evidence for last: a compilation of Reynolds' own words caught on body camera footage over the years. The room listened in stunned silence as Reynolds' prejudices were laid bare in his own voice, his own words condemning him more effectively than any witness could. "Officer Reynolds," the chief said, standing directly in front of him, "the evidence shows a clear pattern of biased policing spanning your entire career. Your actions have not only violated department policy and constitutional rights, but have also broken the trust between law enforcement and the community we serve." Reynolds finally looked up, meeting the chief's gaze for the first time since the hearing began. The arrogance from that traffic stop was gone, replaced by something that looked like recognition, perhaps the first time he truly saw the impact of his actions. The review board didn't need much time to deliberate. The chief delivered their decision with the same calm authority he'd maintained throughout the hearing. But this wasn't just about one officer's fate, it was about sending a message to the entire department. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, the chief prepared to announce their decision. The room held its breath, knowing that whatever came next would change the department forever. The chief stood at the podium in the department's press room, cameras flashing as he prepared to announce the review board's decision. The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and officers from every precinct. Outside, hundreds of citizens gathered around mounted screens, waiting to hear the outcome of this landmark case. After careful review of all evidence presented, the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "The board has unanimously decided to terminate Officer Reynolds' employment with immediate effect. Additionally, all cases involving Officer Reynolds will be reviewed by an independent committee." A murmur ran through the crowd, but the chief raised his hand for silence. However, this decision is just the beginning. What we uncovered during this investigation revealed problems that go far beyond one officer's actions. He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him displayed a comprehensive plan titled Department Reform Initiative. The chief continued, "Today, we're announcing sweeping changes to our department's policies and procedures." The reforms were ambitious and far-reaching. Every officer would undergo enhanced bias training, not just once, but quarterly. Body cameras would now automatically upload footage to an independent server, preventing any possibility of tampering. A new civilian oversight committee would have real power to investigate complaints. But perhaps most importantly, the chief emphasized, we're implementing a complete overhaul of our traffic stop procedures. He outlined a new system where officers would need to document their reason for each stop before activating their lights, creating a real-time record that could be monitored for patterns of bias. In the weeks that followed, the changes began taking effect. The department's training center was transformed, with new instructors brought in to teach de-escalation techniques and cultural awareness. The chief's own experience during that traffic stop became a central case study, used to show officers how bias can cloud judgment. The impact rippled through the community. People who had been afraid to drive through certain neighborhoods began to feel safer. Officers reported more positive interactions with citizens. The wall of silence that had protected bad behavior started to crumble as more officers felt empowered to speak up when they witnessed misconduct. 1 month after the hearing, the chief sat in his office reviewing the latest statistics. Traffic stop numbers had decreased, but the success rate of legitimate stops had increased. Civilian complaints were down, and community feedback was increasingly positive. A knock at his door interrupted his review. A young officer entered, looking nervous but determined. "Chief," she said, "I need to report something I witnessed during my patrol yesterday." The chief gestured for her to sit down, noting how different this felt from the old days when officers would look the other way. "Tell me what happened," he said, reaching for his notebook. After taking her statement, the chief walked through the department halls, observing the changes. The walls now displayed the department's new mission statement, to protect and serve, equally, fairly, always. In the training room, officers were engaged in scenario-based learning, practicing how to handle traffic stops without letting bias influence their actions. The community outreach office, once a quiet corner of the building, was now a hub of activity. Citizens felt comfortable walking in to share concerns or just talk with officers. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared responsibility for community safety. 6 months after Reynolds' termination, the department hosted its first community police academy, where citizens could learn about law enforcement procedures and share their perspectives. The chief stood at the back of the room, watching as officers and community members engaged in open, honest dialogue. The case that started with one biased traffic stop had become a catalyst for real change. Other departments across the country began requesting copies of the reform plan, looking to implement similar changes in their own jurisdictions. 1 year to the day after that fateful traffic stop, the chief stood again at the podium, this time to present the department's annual report. The numbers told a powerful story: civilian complaints down by 60%, community trust ratings up by 45%, and a more diverse force that better reflected the community it served. What happened that night, the chief concluded, looking out at the assembled crowd, could have been just another incident swept under the rug. Instead, it became the spark that lit the fire of real change. We still have work to do, but for the first time, we're truly living up to our motto of protecting and serving everyone equally. As he stepped away from the podium, a reporter called out, "Do you regret what happened that night?" The chief paused, considering the question carefully. "I regret that it took something so personal to expose these problems," he said finally. "But I don't regret where it led us. Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest experiences. What matters is what we do with those lessons." He glanced down at his wrists, where the handcuff marks had long since faded. The physical marks might have disappeared, but the impact of that night had left an indelible mark on the department, the community, and the future of policing in their city.